Have you ever stopped to wonder how a simple shift in perspective could transform your entire life? Imagine waking up each morning with a heart full of gratitude, not just for the big moments, but for the small, seemingly ordinary details that often go unnoticed. What if this practice could be the key to unlocking a deep, lasting peace within you? Gratitude is more than just saying, "Thank you." It is an art, a way of living that has been cherished and taught for thousands of years. In Buddhist philosophy, gratitude is not a fleeting feeling, it's a profound state of being, one that cultivates contentment, dissolves suffering, and opens the door to true peace, in our fast-paced modern world. It's easy to get caught up in stress, worry, and the endless chase for more. Yet, ironically, it's often when we slow down and recognize the blessings already present in our lives that we find real happiness. The practice of living with gratitude shifts our focus from what we lack to what we already have, a shift that ripples outward, affecting not only our own well-being but the world around us. Today, we will explore this transformative power of gratitude through the lens of Buddhist wisdom. We'll uncover why gratitude is considered a foundational practice for cultivating inner peace and how it connects deeply with mindfulness, compassion, and the very nature of existence. But first, let's take a moment to reflect. How often do you pause and truly appreciate the people, experiences, and even challenges that have shaped who you are? What would it feel like if you allowed gratitude to become the guiding force in your daily life? To truly grasp the power of gratitude, we must first dive into the timeless wisdom of Buddhist philosophy. Gratitude, in Buddhism, is far more than a polite feeling or social nicety. It is a profound awareness that permeates every moment of our existence. At the core of Buddhism lies the teaching of interconnectedness, known as pratityasamutpada or dependent origination. This principle reveals that nothing exists in isolation. Every event, every person, every breath we take arises because of countless causes and conditions. When we understand this, gratitude naturally arises as we recognize how much we owe to the world around us. Consider this: the food we eat depends on the sun, the rain, the soil, the labor of farmers, the kindness of strangers who bring it to our table. Our very existence depends on our parents, teachers, friends, and even those we may have never met. This recognition invites us into a deep state of humility and appreciation, a fertile ground for gratitude, but Buddhist gratitude goes even deeper. It is tied closely to the concept of non-self, anatta, the understanding that there is no permanent, independent I. This truth dissolves the ego-centered view that we alone create our happiness or sufferings. Instead, it opens our heart to a relational way of being, where gratitude flows naturally because we see ourselves as part of an intricate web of life. Moreover, gratitude in Buddhism is inseparable from compassion, karu, and loving-kindness, metta. To be truly grateful is to acknowledge not only what benefits us but also the efforts and struggles of others. It softens the heart, breaks down barriers of self-centeredness, and invites us to respond with kindness and generosity. The Buddha himself modeled this attitude. He taught his disciples to appreciate their teachers, their spiritual friends, Kalyamita, and even the obstacles they faced on the path, understanding these as opportunities for growth. There is a famous story about a monk who thanked a thorny bush that protected him from wild animals, illustrating how gratitude extends beyond pleasant experiences to include all facets of life. This broad and profound understanding of gratitude transcends the typical thank you. It becomes a transformative way to relate to reality, a lens that reveals the sacred in everyday moments and nurtures peace within. In this light, gratitude is not a passive feeling but an active practice. It calls for mindfulness to see clearly, wisdom to understand deeply, and an open heart to respond gently. It reshapes our view of life from scarcity to abundance, from isolation to connection, from suffering to liberation. As we move forward, we'll explore how mindfulness, the art of being fully present, helps us cultivate this deep gratitude. We will learn practical ways to awaken this quality within ourselves and integrate it into the rhythm of daily living. Remember, gratitude, seen through the Buddhist lens, is a doorway, a gateway to awakening, compassion, and profound peace. It invites us to transform not only how we feel but how we live. In our fast-moving world, it's easy to get swept away by worries, plans, and endless distractions. We often miss the simple gifts hidden in the present moment: a gentle breeze, a warm smile, the taste of morning tea. This is where mindfulness steps in, like a gentle lighthouse guiding us back to the here and now. Mindfulness, or sati in Pali, is the practice of intentionally paying attention, moment by moment, without judgment. It is the cornerstone of Buddhist practice and the key to unlocking the natural wellspring of gratitude within us. Imagine waking up each day and truly seeing the sunlight streaming through your window, feeling the breath entering and leaving your body, hearing the sounds around you without rushing past them. This simple act of presence creates space, a pause where gratitude can grow. One story often told in Buddhist circles illustrates this beautifully. A monk, renowned for his serene presence, would sit by the river every morning. Instead of merely watching the water flow, he observed each ripple, each leaf drifting by, with childlike wonder. Through this mindful awareness, he experienced deep gratitude for the river's endless gift of life, and this gratitude nourished his peace. Mindfulness teaches us that gratitude is not about forcing ourselves to feel thankful. Instead, it's about cultivating awareness of what is already present. When we slow down and truly notice, gratitude naturally emerges, as a gentle wave rising from the depths of our being. This practice also helps us break free from the habit of comparison and craving, which often cloud our sense of contentment. By focusing on what is, rather than what is missing, mindfulness grounds us in reality, reminding us that life, in all its imperfection, is enough. Incorporating mindfulness into daily life can be simple yet transformative. Start with small moments: savor your meal, feel the texture of your clothes, listen fully when someone speaks. Over time, these moments accumulate, weaving gratitude into the fabric of your existence. Buddhist teachers often emphasize that mindfulness and gratitude walk hand in hand. As we become more present, we become more grateful, and as we grow in gratitude, our presence deepens. This creates a virtuous cycle, a fertile ground for lasting peace. Gratitude is a seed, a powerful seed, but like any seed, it needs nurturing to grow strong and flourish. The question is, how can we cultivate this seed every day, especially amid the challenges and distractions of modern life? Buddhist teachings offer timeless guidance, and today, we'll explore practical ways to bring gratitude into your daily routine. Simple yet profound practices that can transform your heart and mind. 1. Start a gratitude journal. One of the most effective ways to develop gratitude is by keeping a daily journal. Every evening, write down 3 things you are thankful for. They can be as small as a comforting cup of tea or as big as a supportive friend. There's a story about a woman who, after losing her job, started this practice. Initially, it felt hard to find anything positive, but slowly, she began to notice small blessings: a kind word from a stranger, the beauty of a sunset, the strength to keep moving forward. This shift in focus helped her rebuild hope and resilience. 2. Morning gratitude meditation. Begin each day with a few minutes of meditation focused on gratitude. Sit quietly, breathe deeply, and bring to mind the people, experiences, or things that bring joy and comfort. Buddhist monks often begin their day this way, cultivating a mindset of appreciation before the busyness begins. This practice sets a tone of calm and openness, allowing gratitude to color the rest of the day. 3. Express your thanks. Gratitude is not just an internal feeling, it becomes powerful when shared. Make it a habit to thank the people around you, whether it's a colleague, family member, or even a stranger. A famous Zen story tells of a monk who thanked a tree every day for its shade. This simple act of acknowledgement transformed his relationship with the natural world and deepened his sense of interconnectedness. 4. Practice acts of kindness. Gratitude and generosity go hand in hand. When we feel thankful, we naturally want to give back. Small acts of kindness, offering a smile, helping a neighbor, volunteering, reinforce gratitude and spread peace. 5. Reframe challenges. One of the most profound Buddhist insights is to see difficulties as opportunities for growth. When faced with hardship, try to find something to be grateful for, a lesson learned, inner strength discovered, or compassion awakened. This doesn't mean ignoring pain, but embracing a broader perspective. Gratitude becomes a powerful tool to transform suffering into wisdom. 6. Use reminders. Set gentle reminders throughout your day, a note on your mirror, a chime on your phone, to pause and reflect on what you're grateful for in that moment. 7. Be present with nature. Spending time in nature naturally awakens gratitude. Whether it's feeling the breeze on your skin or watching birds in flight, these experiences reconnect us to the larger web of life and inspire appreciation. Stories have a unique power. They touch our hearts, open our minds, and bring ancient wisdom to life. In Buddhism, stories are often used to illustrate profound truths and inspire change. Today, we'll explore real-life transformation sparked by the simple yet powerful practice of gratitude. The story of Sarah. From despair to joy, Sarah was a successful professional who hit rock bottom after losing her job and facing a painful breakup. Her world felt shattered, and despair clouded every day. Then, she discovered a simple practice, listing 3 things she was grateful for every night. At first, it felt forced. But over weeks, she started to notice small moments, the warmth of her morning coffee, a friend's text, the song of birds outside her window. Gradually, these tiny sparks of gratitude became a lifeline. Sarah found herself slowly stepping out of despair, embracing life with new hope and joy. Her transformation mirrors the Buddhist teaching of right mindfulness. By shifting attention to the present and appreciating what is, she loosened the grip of suffering. The tale of Tenzin, gratitude as a path to compassion. Tenzin, a Tibetan monk, once shared how gratitude transformed his attitude towards his own struggles and those of others. Growing up in harsh conditions, he initially felt bitterness and resentment. But through meditation and reflection, he recognized how much he depended on countless unseen acts of kindness, from his parents to strangers. This deepened his compassion. He realized that gratitude is not just a feeling but a doorway to metta, loving kindness, and active compassion. Tenzin's journey illustrates how gratitude dissolves the barriers of ego and isolation, opening the heart wide. The lesson from a thorny bush. There's an ancient Zen story about a monk who thanked a thorny bush every day. The bush was painful to touch, yet it protected him from wild animals. This paradox teaches us to be grateful even for difficulties, as they often serve as unexpected protectors or teachers. This story reminds us of the Buddhist principle of embracing suffering, not denying pain, but seeing it as part of life's unfolding and a catalyst for growth. Cultivating gratitude is a profound practice, but it is not without its challenges. Life's inevitable hardships, loss, disappointment, stress, can cloud our ability to see the gifts around us. Even the most dedicated practitioners can struggle to maintain a grateful heart during difficult times. Understanding these obstacles through a Buddhist lens helps us navigate them skillfully and with compassion. The first challenge, the mind's negativity bias. Our brains are wired to focus on threats and problems, a survival mechanism known as the negativity bias. This can make it easy to overlook what's good in life and fixate on what's wrong. Buddhist teachings encourage us to train the mind intentionally, like a gardener tending a wild field. Through practices such as meditation and mindful reflection, we gradually rewire our focus towards positive, nourishing thoughts, including gratitude. Story of John, battling inner criticism. John, a longtime meditation practitioner, found himself trapped in self-criticism and despair after a serious illness. His mind repeatedly questioned, "Why me? What did I do wrong?" Gratitude felt distant, almost impossible. One day, his teacher advised him to simply acknowledge these difficult feelings without judgment and gently bring his attention back to one small thing he could appreciate, the warmth of sunlight on his skin. Slowly, John learned that gratitude doesn't require denying pain. It coexists with it. This acceptance softened his suffering and opened the door to healing. The second challenge, comparing and envying others. Social media and modern culture often fuel comparison, making gratitude harder to sustain. When we measure ourselves against others' curated successes, feelings of lack or envy arise. Buddhism teaches the principle of contentment, santuthi, appreciating what we have rather than craving what we don't. Practicing contentment helps us see that true happiness and gratitude arise from within, not from external circumstances. The third challenge, forgetting impermanence. Sometimes, gratitude fades because we take blessings for granted, forgetting that all things are impermanent, anicca. This impermanence can either cause attachment or inspire deeper appreciation, when we remember that every moment, every relationship, and every breath is precious precisely because it won't last forever. Gratitude becomes more vivid and urgent. Practical Buddhist tools to overcome challenges. Mindful awareness. Notice when negative thoughts or comparisons arise without judgment. Label them and gently return to present gratitude. Loving kindness meditation. Cultivate metta to soften resentment and envy, opening the heart to appreciation. Reflection on impermanence. Contemplate how fleeting life is to deepen appreciation for the present. The path of gratitude is a dynamic journey. It is not about perfection, but persistence and gentle self-compassion. Every challenge we face is an opportunity to deepen our practice, to meet ourselves with kindness, and to transform difficulty into insight. As we prepare to close this journey in the next chapter, remember that gratitude is both a destination and a path. It is a lifelong dance of opening, surrendering, and embracing the full spectrum of life. As we conclude this journey into the art of living with gratitude, it becomes clear that gratitude is far more than a fleeting emotion. It is a profound way of being, a lens through which we can view life with clarity, compassion, and peace. Buddhist philosophy teaches us that gratitude opens the heart, softens the mind, and anchors us deeply in the present moment. It allows us to embrace life's joys and challenges alike, transforming ordinary experiences into sources of wisdom and serenity. Living with gratitude is not about ignoring pain or hardship, but about weaving appreciation through every thread of our existence. It is the art of recognizing that even in difficulty, there is something to be thankful for, a lesson, a strength, a moment of kindness. When we cultivate gratitude daily, we cultivate peace, peace within ourselves and peace that radiates outward to others. This is the true power of gratitude. It dissolves the walls of separation and connects us to the vast web of life. So, what can you do next? Start where you are. Take a moment now to breathe deeply and silently acknowledge one thing in your life that you are grateful for. Let that gratitude fill your heart. If this video has inspired you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Your support helps us create more content that nourishes the soul and spreads peace. We would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below sharing what gratitude means to you or a moment when gratitude transformed your life. Your story might inspire someone else on their path. Thank you for taking this journey with us. May your life be filled with gratitude, peace, and boundless joy.